Welcome to Warhammer Warscroll Review. I am the Twin Coot, and in this video we'll be taking a look at the Flesh Eater Court's endless spells.
Warscroll Review.
With the new Flesh Eater Court's battletome just released, let's look back on our ghoulish friends. The new release brought 3 new endless spells, which is common for updated tomes these days. I've yet to review an endless spell, and was about to start with the Chalice of Usharan, but it didn't really go that long, so I figured I'd throw all 3 in the same review. Let's start with the easiest to cover, the Corpsemare Stampede. Spell casts on a 7 and can only be summoned by Nagash or an abhorrent model, which obviously would be a Ghoul King or an Archregent character from the Flesh Eater Court's army. This one is a bit different from most other endless spells in that it sets up 3d6 away from the caster. On average, this means about 10 inches away. The Stampede is a predatory spell, meaning it moves and it has a speedy 14-inch flying movement. After being set up, it can immediately be moved by the caster and has one special effect called Trampled Underfoot. Trampled Underfoot triggers after the model has moved. Roll 5 dice for each unit that it passed across. For each roll above the target's wound characteristic, the unit suffers 1 mortal wound. For each 6, the spell deals d3 mortal wounds. It's actually not a bad effect. It was a bit more than I was expecting. One downside is that it is quite expensive when compared to other endless spells, with a 60-point price tag. With these points, you could be getting another CP or basically any other endless spell. Quite the trade-off. To be fair, the Flesh Eater Courts aren't swimming in mortal wound output, so this one is a welcome addition. But as the effectiveness is tied to the opponent's stats, it won't be equally effective against each target. On infantry, this will reliably be doing 4 or 5 mortal wounds, which outshine a lot of the other direct damage spells. But on monstrous cavalry or larger, this will be a fairly ineffective ability, which is kind of the downfall of the spell. Yes, you can kill infantry fairly well, but Flesh Eater Courts can already kill infantry fairly well. Ghouls just overload infantry, and many other healing abilities make challenging the larger units to a battle of attrition a bad idea. So in my eyes, the Stampede is not really hurting the units Flesh Eaters need help with. The other huge downside is that it is a predatory spell, so if you take the top of the next turn, your opponent now gets to use your new toy. This give and take that predatory spells ensure really turns me off. Unless of course you are sure that you can get the Stampede far enough away from you. But Flesh Eater Courts tend to be an offensive army rushing up the board, so casting your Stampede forward, then moving it won't push it far enough forward that it can't come crashing back into your lines next turn. One point to counter the last 2, when playing the Terrorgeist as your battle line army, the Stampede will have little effect on your models if it does backlash, and will be killing multiple small units, which is what Terrorgeists tend to have trouble with. One final note, I do want to mention that a 7+ casting value is kinda high, even with Flesh Eater Courts getting a few ways to increase casting rolls. The second Flesh Eater endless spell to discuss is the Cadaverous Barricade. The Barricade can be casted on a 5, it can only be summoned by Nagash or an abhorrent model. It can be set up within 24 inches of the caster, and more than 1 inch from an enemy. It can't move, so the range of this spell is imperative. After it's set up, it grants 2 effects. Grasping Hands is its first special rule. If a non-death model starts within 3 inches of the barricade, they must have their movement. This can have an extremely debilitating effect on the enemy. Losing half your movement to some units means that they aren't doing anything that turn. The other special rule this spell grants is a cover save to units with all their models within 1 inch. The barricade also has to be closer to the target, so it kinda has to be between the defender and the attacker. This is nice to get a little bit extra durability when you would otherwise have been out in the open. This spell could potentially be placed ahead of one of your units with the intention of moving in range of the cover bonus during the movement phase. For example, we could position the barricade 8 inches in front of some horrors. To keep the horrors moving even faster with the barricade, you could place it 8 plus 6 inches ahead, planning on a 6-inch run using at the double. Just using horrors as an example here, any unit would work fine as long as they can receive a cover bonus. The idea is to place the barricade just ahead of where your unit is about to move. The Cadaverous Barricade is only 30 points, which is relatively cheap for an endless spell, and can easily be thrown in after you're done building your army because you have a few points left over. Generally, there are two ways to use your barricade, offensively or defensively. I do say or because you won't often be able to make it fill both roles effectively because both special abilities have extremely low ranges. If used offensively, you'll be focusing on the first special rule, Grasping Hands. Like I said, very short 3-inch range. Lean towards this rule when you're facing an army that will be rushing towards you, or even just to break up an army. If only some of your opponent's units can move forward, they may have to hold the whole thing back. This is especially true for support characters. If you can hold back a couple support characters with the barricade, the opponent will either have to choose to stay in aura ranges or wait a turn before they can move forward. Placement of the barricade is key. It is quite long, so it could pretty easily get multiple units in range of Grasping Hands. Having multiple units movement would be extremely powerful and throw off most melee armies. The other way this thing could really hinder the enemy is by placing it directly in front of them. If placed correctly, the enemy could spend their entire half movement just trying to move around the object. Be aware of the obvious counter to this tactic though. As the effect only triggers in the movement phase, the opponent will have a chance to dispel it. And since it has a low casting value of 5, it will be relatively easy to dispel. But still, not a bad roadblock that the opponent will have to waste a spell on. If it gets dispelled, just keep casting it back up to throw off the opponent's plans. I would say be sure not to leave it in a place the opponent can gather around and then benefit from the cover save, but Fleshier Quartz has very little shooting, so it really won't come up. If you are worried about the cover save benefit, set up the barricade directly behind the unit you're trying to slow down. A final reminder, if you're facing death units, this will have no effect on them. And currently death is fairly popular in the meta, so definitely keep that in mind. The other way to use the Cadaverous Barricade is defensively. Not only will the barricade provide the cover bonus, there are other protections this model adds that are not as straightforward. Placing the barricade right between the enemy and your unit can keep them from charging your unit. Keeping the opponent from getting within 1 inch of your models can be fairly easy if you drop the wall right in front of your models. They could go around, but if you position the unit in parallel with the wall, they will be limited on how many models can get in range. Using terrain to your advantage, you could set up a barricade between, say, 2 houses, for example. This could block the opponent's path for multiple movement phases as they maneuver around the obstacle. Generally, I would say use the barricade offensively if the opponent is moving forward, or if they don't have a lot of chances to dispel. If the enemy won't even notice losing a single spell to dispel the barricades, or if they are just standing there shooting you, use the spell defensively. The Cadaverous Barricade is a fairly unique endless spell in that its physical presence is almost as influential as its actual rules. This is interesting to think of uses, but somewhat limits its direct synergies. One interesting synergy that exists is with another endless spell that is actually fairly similar to the Barricade, the Prismatic Palisade. This one was introduced with the Malign Sorcery expansion and offers line of sight blocking potential. A lot of the same uses about obstruction goes for this spell as well, but I bring this up because now we could have 2 walls. Fleshier Quartz can really kind of force the opponent into certain areas by blocking them off with either the Palisade or the Barricade. Place a wall on either side to funnel the enemy into a unit of ghouls or something defensive, or even so the enemy can only get 1 model up against a Terrorgeist at a time. Do note that they both cast on a 5, which makes them fairly easily removed, but the opponent is now wasting 2 dispels to do so. A lot of opponents will begrudgingly waste a casting attempt to dispel, but forcing them to do it twice will really make them think if they can go without their magic phase for that turn to keep moving forward. The next synergy to mention is another endless spell, the Soul Snare Shackles. This is actually 3 models that are set up when the spell casts. If a unit starts their movement within 6 inches of a shackle, have their movement characteristic on a roll of 3+. Obviously this looks just like the rule from the Barricade and would create more space on the board the enemy will just not want to pass through. And before you ask, the Barricade and Shackles will stack because one halves the movement characteristic and the other halves the distance a unit can move. So slightly confusing, but the run roll will only be halved once since it isn't part of the movement characteristic. But in any case, that means you have slowed the opponent to a crawl. If that was a melee unit, you have rendered it useless for a turn with very little effort. I won't go into much detail, but conversely, Flesh Eater Courts with high movement, fly, or the ability to move out of turn will work well with the Barricade, as they will be better able to maneuver around the slowed opponent and the walls themselves. The final endless spell to cover is also an interesting one, the Chalice of Usharan. This spell casts on a 6 and can be set up wholly within 24 inches, giving it a solid range compared to other endless spells. Like all the others, the caster is limited to the abhorrent models and Nagash. This one is not a predatory spell, so it doesn't move. It just has one effect, Soul Stealer. Keep track of the number of models slain within 12 inches of the chalice. At the start of each turn, roll a die for each model counted, and on a 4+, allocate 1 wound or a 1 wound model to a unit within 12 inches. Not bad considering you have 24 inches to throw it where you want. One of the best parts to this spell is that it heals in both your turn and the opponent's, giving you double the use out of it. It triggers at the start of each turn, so the opponent won't be able to dispel it before it goes off, but also means you're waiting a turn after it casts before it does anything. The unit causing the wounds doesn't even have to be the recipient of the healing, so you could crash a unit of ghouls into the opponent to rack up some deaths on both sides, then use the dice to reinforce another one of your units on your flank, provided it was in range of the chalice. It's hard to estimate how much the chalice can heal, since it is so unreliable, so do keep that in mind. You either have to be killing stuff or losing models for it to have an effect. But because it is a relatively low casting value, it is good to just set and forget, hopefully sitting there for most of the game, or at least force the opponent to waste a dispel. With spell casting being not too hard to come by in the faction, Flesh Eaters won't be too bothered by having to summon the chalice back again. The Chalice of Usharan has a comparable point cost to the other endless spells, clocking in at 40 points. In terms of unit synergies, ghouls tend to be a better synergy here since they are often the screening units. They tend to take a lot of casualties while still dealing damage out themselves, keeping the number of models slain near the chalice higher. Not saying units like Terrorgeist or Horrors don't work to rack up the points, but they really need to be dishing out a good bit of damage themselves to keep up with the numbers the ghouls will be putting out. Really, any Flesh Eater Court unit would love this healing, and pairing it with the multiple other healing effects in the Flesh Eater Court's army makes it even more interesting. Units like Crypt Horrors, Ghoul Kings, and Terrorgeists naturally come with self-healing abilities. Crypt Horrors heal 1 back, while Kings and Geists potentially get back D3 wounds. With the Terrorgeist or Zombie Dragon mount trait horribly resilient, Royal Blood's D3 becomes an automatic 3. Terrorgeists also get an additional D3 healing boost from the Royal Menagerie Warscroll Battalion. Plus the new Archregent even heals a flat 3 wounds in your hero phase. So you could have a whole bubble of just units healing back multiple times a turn. Well, there you have it. Tactics and synergies for the 3 Flesh Eater Court's endless spells. Now, you probably noticed Nagash can summon all 3 of these spells, with varying degrees of effectiveness. Any army would love to slow down the opponent or deal mortal wounds, so the Corpsemare Stampede or Cadaverous Barricade can be useful for a Legion of Nagash. Pretty much all the tactics I mentioned before still apply. But unless Nagash is leading a Death Grand Alliance with a sizable amount of Flesh Eater units, the effects of the Chalice will largely go unnoticed. In the end, all 3 endless spells do offer Flesh Eater Court some more options. Do you need more mortal wound output? You have the Corpsemare Stampede. Do you need to protect yourself or fend off a unit for a turn or two? Try the Cadaverous Barricade. And if you just want your army to last longer, take the Chalice of Ucharon. The Corpsemare Stampede receive a 3 out of 5, while the Cadaverous Barricade and Chalice of Ucharon receive a 4 out of 5. The Chalice has a more obvious benefit, but I think the Cadaverous Barricade will show up later on as an extremely frustrating tool at the Flesh Eater Court's disposal, maybe paired with the Palisade. What do you think of these endless spells? What War Scrolls would you like to see reviewed next on the channel? Let me know your suggestions, questions, and thoughts in the comments below, and thanks for watching.